talk about assessing speaking and writing. Now, as your textbook talks about, we have 4 skills: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. Speaking and writing are the productive skills. That's what we call them. That's where your students produce language. The other 2 are receptive skills. That's the input, and that would be reading and listening. The structure of this video is simple. We're going to first talk about some sample ways that you can assess your students' abilities in speaking and writing. And then after that, we're going to talk about the subskills of assessment. That means what are the little things that you can look for when you assess their ability to speak and write. And then finally, I'm going to end on a couple rubrics. Okay, let's take a look at some sample ways that you can assess your students' ability to write. 3 common sample ways would be, number 1, the use of essays. That's quite common. You could have your students do some things such as research-based essays, argumentative type-based essays, expository, where you teach your students the structure of how an essay works, what's an introduction paragraph, what's a conclusion paragraph, and they practice and they write that, and you assess them on their ability to produce that. Example number 2 would be perhaps you have your students write something simple such as a postcard and you teach them how to structure a letter, or you have them write a business email or some type of interbusiness memo. Maybe that's a part of the course you're teaching, and you assess their ability to do this type of particular communication. And the third thing would be the idea of use of a portfolio. A portfolio has a lot of varieties to it. In essence, they are a collection of your students' work that give maybe a more holistic picture of their ability to write. Portfolios commonly have students' ability to revise the content within their portfolio, and they often have reflection. So your student will reflect on what they've learned about writing, and that's a common thing to a type of portfolio type of assessment. These are just examples. Regardless of how you assess your students' abilities, you have that option of having that one-time hand-in product in writing to assess, or commonly it would be the use of a process-based, meaning you have them do drafts and revisions and you grade them on their ability to revise their work and turn in a final product. Both of those are options regardless of what type of writing activity you do. There are lots of different ways you can assess your students' ability to speak. I'm going to give you 5 sample activities to get you thinking about the topic. Idea number 1 would be having your students do a sort of speech in front of the class. That could be something that they planned at home, or it could be an impromptu type of speech that they do in front of the class. Idea number 2 would be the simple use of a presentation that has, for example, a PowerPoint that they prepared that they must present and do an introduction and body and a conclusion in a presentation type of format. The third type of sample one could be a group discussion, meaning you have your students in pairs perhaps, and they have to communicate and you assess their ability to communicate amongst each other. Actually, that's quite common to do that type of teacher watch the pair communicate. The third type of sample activity would be the use of an interview, meaning you could interview your student on a wide variety of topics that perhaps go with your textbook, and you assess their ability to effectively go back and forth and understand what you're saying and respond appropriately. And a fifth type of assessment you could do for speaking would be role plays, meaning you give your students a scenario and they go up and they role play and you assess their ability to naturally and effectively communicate between each other. So let's talk about the sub-skills of assessing writing, meaning what are the little things you can look for after they turn in their essay or after they turn in their email. There are a lot of different things you can look for. I'm going to give you 6 different samples. Number 1 thing that you could look for would be the development of ideas, meaning did your students answer the prompt appropriately? Did they follow the directions in your writing assignment? That would be a common thing to look for. Number 2 would be the organization. This is really common. Your students might have amazing grammar, but the organization of their email or the organization of their essay or whatever they're writing is off. Maybe they're following the pattern of their native language and it is very confusing and hard to read. So you need to rate your students and teach them the organization of English writing, which is really important. And the third thing would be tone, the use of tone. This is super important. Maybe my students write, again, a perfectly grammatically correct email to me, but it says, "My dearest teacher, yours truly, Wang Jin." They didn't understand the tone. They don't understand the difference between professional language or formal language and informal language. Maybe they say, "Hey dude," or "Hey teacher." And so they need to understand the tone, formal words and informal words. So I can grade them on that. The fourth one, very common, would be the use of vocabulary, the variety, the appropriate use of vocabulary and grammar. How well do they understand the grammatical structures and use them in their writing? And the fifth one, which is also really common, mechanics. That means like punctuation and spelling and things of that nature, which is usually less important. They're all important, but you can have a punctuation issue and it is not going to affect the communication as much as, for example, having a very poor tone. So that's something I want you to think about. Often they are not rated equally in your rubric. And the sixth one that you could, depending on your assignment, assess would be the idea of their revision or their drafting process. How well did they revise and draft to reach that final product if you did do drafting? Now let's talk about the subskills, or the little things you can assess in someone's speaking ability. The first three are going to be very similar and same to the ones you had in writing. You could, again, assess a student's ability to have development of ideas. You could assess a student's organization. If they're giving a presentation, that has to be organized. Number three, you can assess a student's appropriate use of vocabulary and grammar. In addition to those, you also have things such as fluency, meaning does the student stop a lot? Do they have awkward pauses in their speech, or are they more fluid in their ability to deliver language? The fifth one would be pronunciation. It's important when you rate pronunciation that it's not the goal to be native-like, rather we want them to be understood. So many times we kind of say a rule would be pronunciation should be corrected if it hinders one's ability to understand your students. But definitely pronunciation is a part of that you should be assessing in speaking. And the final sample one would be the idea of communicative competency. That deals with syntax and phonology, but also it deals with the idea of socially appropriate language being used in communication. So for instance, if you're interviewing your students and they say things such as, how old are you? Maybe that is something that you have taught them that's not appropriate. In our culture, we don't say that. And so they need to learn how to not only speak appropriately in terms of grammar and phonology and organization, but also what can be said and when it can be said and who it can be said to. So that's definitely something that you can assess as well in speaking. In this last section, I want to talk to you about two common types of rubrics, holistic and analytic. In a holistic rubric, which is going to be much less common for you to use, it's used when you have a wide variety of responses. Maybe you have like a creative writing piece, and it focuses on that end summative product, the summative quality of the product. They are used, they're just not going to be as common as the analytic rubric for most of you. So in the analytic rubric, you have one of the main purposes of them is to create consistency. So your students all have a grade. They understand why I have a B and he has a C. It's written in my analytic rubric. And I particularly enjoy analytic rubrics because I can highlight or circle certain things and my students know exactly, or more specifically, what their strengths are and what their weaknesses are. And that is a little bit harder to do in the holistic rubrics, which is why I almost always do analytical. So that analytical rubric here and all those subcategories or subskills are going to be more common for you. Many of my TEFL trainees are intimidated by rubrics. They say, oh my God, that looks so hard to make. I do strongly encourage you to look into the millions of resources online. There's a bunch of rubrics already made. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel, and modify those to your particular assignments. It is honestly a very useful tool for your students to see what they're doing well in and what they need to work on. And so I strongly encourage you to consider using them when you assess those productive skills. Okay, so that's the end of this video. I hope you've gotten something out of a look at some sample types of assessments you can do, some sub-skills you can test within those assessments, and then finally we took a look at some sample rubrics. Thank you.